Hello everyone, this is Shadow. Due to copyright restrictions on YouTube, I can't publish many of the audiobooks you love. That's why I've created a special paid service where you can enjoy over 300 high-quality audiobooks from platforms like Webnovel, Pocket FM, Audible, Wuxia, and more. Each novel comes as a one-time purchase, no subscriptions, no hidden fees. After payment, you'll receive full access via Telegram, along with all future updates for that novel. You'll find a wide selection of your favorite genres and titles, always in premium audio quality. Check the full list of available novels in the description. DM me now to get your favorite stories in audiobook form and start listening today. Chapter 1363 Judgment's Talent. Chapter 1363 Judgment's Talent. Something black and sinuous extended from Judgment's back, wriggling in the air, with an edge so sharp the wind seemed scared of getting cut. Jerrymoth stood waiting. He studied the strange tentacle for a moment, then cocked his head with a menacing tilt. So, one more hand. The talent you seem to place your hope in is just one more hand. Judgment grinned. You'll be surprised how much just one more hand can change. She spun both halves of her broken spear and shot forward. Without her wings she wasn't nearly as fast, and Jerrymoth could see it plainly. The nature of the being she was baffled him greatly. How did she have another talent? He'd been convinced the wings were it. Of course, there was no way for Jerrymoth to have known that Judgment was a completely different race. She only looked and functioned like a human at best. In truth, she was nothing like one. Jerrymoth raised his shield, ready to bash her aside, and angled his sword slightly behind him. That one would finish the job. His eyes tracked the tentacle as it wriggled behind her, seemingly useless. As she covered half the distance, the tentacle moved. It snapped forward with the speed of a released rubber band and slammed into his shield. The impact split the air. A ring of shockwave exploded outward, tearing dust from the ground in a widening circle, and Jerrymoth was sent flying back. His boots carved furrows into the earth before he left it entirely, the force behind that single strike far beyond what anything that thin had any right to produce. Judgment leaped into the air, twirled, raised the sharp edge of her spear, and drove it down at him as he plummeted. But Jerrymoth was sharp. He used his shield to shove the spearhead aside, and the two crashed to the ground together, Judgment's spear biting into the earth beside them. The tentacle immediately lashed down. Jerrymoth released his sword, and this time he didn't need to hurl it. The blade rolled through the air like it had a mind of its own, intercepting the tentacle as it struck again. The sinuous black flesh was thicker than it appeared, and the sword clashed against it, causing the thing to stiffen for a moment, but tearing through it was proving difficult. Jerrymoth dodged the tentacle's first strike by snapping his head sideways while the sword kept it busy on the second. Both of their arms were locked. Judgment pinned him with her hands and raw strength while Jerrymoth strained beneath her, unable to pour his full power into resisting when that terrible tentacle demanded half his attention. His sword retreated and clashed against it over and over, buying him seconds, but nothing more. Judgment grinned through it all. She winced at every strike of the sword against her tentacle, but she still grinned wickedly at him. You can make your weapon weightless by touching it. You can command your weapon to move by not touching it. Let me guess, you can also increase the weight by not touching it. She tilted her head. What exactly are your abilities? Or are you simply a master? Jerrymoth stared blankly, his eyes tracing the tentacle. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you. Judgment's wicked grin turned darker. Same here. Another tentacle grew from her back and wriggled in the air. Jerrymoth glared at it. As the second tentacle came down on his head, Judgment saw the ground beneath him cave inward, as though the man had suddenly become impossibly heavy. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, and in that fraction, a terrible force yanked him from beneath her, dragged him through the crumbling ground and launched him into the air. He froze at the apex, suspended, weightless. Then the weight returned. All of it and more. He dropped like a stone and slammed into the ground knees first, and the earth buckled beneath him. A small crater bloomed outward from the point of impact, cracks webbing through the stone, dust rising in a slow cloud around his kneeling form. Judgment slowly straightened. The two tentacles behind her curled forward over her shoulders like demonic guardians, their edges catching what little light remained. She watched him from across the broken ground, the halves of her spear resting loose in her grip. Jerrymoth extended his hand. His shield returned to him, then his sword. He rolled his shoulders once, fixed Judgment with an indifferent gaze, and after a moment, chuckled. I can mark things, he said, stepping forward. I can mark them to become weightless or twice their weight. The things I mark will always return to my hand when I will it. As a savant, I gained the ability to control the whereabouts of anything I've marked. I can move them from point A to point B, and from point B to point A. I can't move them freely around. It doesn't work like that. Judgment listened with a frown, one tentacle coiling and uncoiling slowly behind her. That explains why he isn't controlling his sword to fight me automatically while he uses his hands. She had first expected this, thinking the weapon had a will of its own. But the man wasn't doing it, so she'd had to resort to another guess. That last one, though, let me guess. You marked yourself and moved yourself from point A to point B. From point B halfway to point A. Jerrymoth smiled and nodded. I like how you pay attention to details. It makes you a very befitting opponent. Judgment scrunched her face in disgust. Okay, I was wrong. Jerrymoth laughed shortly. I spoke down on you and that was very inexperienced of me. But it's not so often one sees someone like you wielding a blade. He paused. I do have a question though. Do you have 2 talents? Although that's not possible. He brushed his chin. Could it be that those wings are a result of your attributes? I have heard of people unlocking the full potential and effects of their attributes, making them stronger. Is that it? Judgment stared for a moment, then burst into laughter. It was sharp and unrestrained, loud enough to carry across the ruined ground between them. Jerrymoth watched her laugh with an unreadable expression, waiting. After a while her laugh slowly receded, and she fixed her still laughing gaze on Jerrymoth. Is that why you revealed your talent to me? Because you feel I'll be obligated to do the same thing? Jerrymoth stared at her. Aren't you? It won't hurt, would it? Judgment stood on one leg and looked down for a moment, considering it. I guess it wouldn't. But no. Chapter 1364 Judgment's Resolve. Chapter 1364 Judgment's Resolve. Jerrymoth was disappointed, but he tried to hide it. He had genuinely thought Judgment would return the favor. He needed that knowledge. There were many parts of this blessing that Ull had bestowed upon them that remained a mystery, and understanding her talent could have helped him unveil how his own attribute was supposed to affect him. But Judgment didn't seem interested in sharing, which meant he had nothing left to hold back for. His gaze darkened. I guess I'll go on to eliminating you now. He dismissed the shield, sending it to the depths of his soul. In its place, a long sword about 8 meters long materialized in his hand, while the great sword still rested in his other grip. Then the helmet of his armor appeared with a burst of sparks, covering his face. The obsidian helm had only a V-shaped visor, and through it, the determination in his eyes burned cold. The atmosphere changed. Judgment tensed. She knew with certainty that her opponent was going for a full offense, and the air around him felt heavier for it, like the man's killing intent alone had weight. Jerrymoth moved first. He covered the distance in 3 strides, the long sword sweeping wide from the left while the greatsword came down from above. 2 weapons that should have been too large and too heavy for any man to swing simultaneously, let alone with that kind of speed. But the blades cut the air like they weighed nothing. Because they didn't. Judgment crossed both halves of her broken spear to catch the greatsword overhead while a tentacle whipped sideways to deflect the longsword. The greatsword slammed into her guard and she felt the weight of it shift the instant it made contact. What had been weightless a heartbeat ago suddenly carried the full force of its true mass and more. Her knees buckled. The ground beneath her feet cracked. The long sword rang against her tentacle and was knocked aside. But Jerrymoth let the deflection carry the blade around in a full rotation and brought it back from her blind spot. She threw herself sideways, rolling across the broken ground, and the long sword carved a deep groove into the earth where she'd been standing. Jerrymoth didn't stop. He advanced with a fluid economy of motion that made his size and his weapons look like extensions of his body. The great sword swept low, forcing her to leap, and the moment she was airborne the longsword was already coming down. She twisted midair and both tentacles shot forward, wrapping around the longsword's blade to hold it in place. The black flesh strained against the metal. Jerrymoth pulled. The tentacles pulled back. For a single second they were locked. Then Jerrymoth released the longsword entirely. It went weightless in her tentacles' grip, and the sudden absence of resistance sent Judgment stumbling backward. By the time she corrected herself, the great sword was already carving toward her midsection. She barely got one spear half up in time. The impact folded her arm and sent her skidding across the ground on her back, dust and stones spraying in her wake. The long sword flew back to Jerrymoth's hand before she stopped sliding. Judgment coughed and pushed herself up on one knee. Blood ran from her lip where she'd bitten it on impact. Her arm throbbed from wrist to shoulder. One of her tentacles hung low, sluggish from the strain of grappling the blade. She grinned. That all you got? Jerrymoth said nothing. He came again. This time it was worse. He used the longsword's reach to keep her at distance, its 8 meters of blade sweeping in long horizontal arcs that forced her to stay low or lose her head. Every time she tried to close the gap, the great sword punished her for it, its weight shifting from nothing to crushing at the point of contact. But Judgment was learning. She couldn't match his power. She couldn't match his technique. She had no training, no formal combat experience, no elegant swordsmanship to draw from. What she had was the stubbornness of something that refused to understand it was supposed to die. Her tentacles moved faster now, not stronger but smarter. She used them to redirect rather than block. When the long sword came sweeping from her left, a tentacle caught the flat of the blade and pushed it past her instead of trying to stop it. When the great sword dropped from above, she didn't brace for it. She dove forward inside his guard where the long weapons became liabilities. Jerimoth adapted immediately. He let the long sword go weightless and whipped it back to create distance. But Judgment was already inside. She drove the sharp end of one broken spear half into the gap between his pauldron and chestplate. The tip bit into something and Jerimoth grunted, the first sound of pain she'd drawn from him. He answered by slamming his elbow into her face. Stars exploded across her vision. She felt her feet leave the ground and then the flat of the greatsword caught her across the ribs and launched her. She tumbled through the air, crashed through a slab of upturned stone, and came to a halt in the rubble beyond it. Jerimoth pulled the broken spear tip from the gap in his armor and looked at the blood on it. His blood. He tossed it aside. "You fight like an animal," he said. His voice was calm behind the helmet. No form, no discipline, just instinct and anger. Judgment pulled herself from the rubble. A tentacle pushed a chunk of stone off her chest. Her left arm hung slightly wrong. Blood traced a line from her hairline to her jaw. She spat red onto the ground. "And you fight like you learned from a book," she said. "Pretty to watch. Let's see how pretty it stays." A third tentacle grew from her back. Jerimoth tilted his head slightly, watching it emerge. He rolled the greatsword in his grip and shifted his stance. The three tentacles fanned out behind her, weaving in slow patterns, their razor edges catching the dim light. She picked up the remaining half of her broken spear from the ground with her good hand. They stared at each other across the ruined ground. Then they both moved. The collision was different this time. Judgment used the tentacles as independent fighters, each one attacking from a different angle while she worked the center with her spear. Jerimoth was forced to give ground for the first time, not because any single strike threatened him, but because 4 points of attack from 4 different directions demanded more than 2 arms could answer cleanly. He answered anyway. The long sword swept in a wide arc that caught 2 tentacles at once, batting them aside with a burst of amplified weight. The great sword flicked out and slapped Judgment's spear from her hand. But the third tentacle was already past his guard, its edge raking across his breastplate and gouging a bright line through the obsidian armor. Jerimoth sent the longsword flying, not at Judgment but behind her. It circled like a predator and came screaming back from her blind side. A tentacle intercepted it. The blade drove the tentacle backward, the black flesh straining and bending, but it held. Barely. The long sword shuddered and flew back to his grip. Judgment was bleeding from a dozen places now. Her left arm was nearly useless. One tentacle moved slower than the others, damaged from catching the longsword head-on. But she was still standing, and she was still grinning. Jerimoth stared at her through the V-shaped visor. For a moment, neither of them moved. His breathing was controlled but heavier than it had been at the start. Thin lines of blood seeped from the gouge in his breastplate and the puncture near his pauldron. She'd drawn blood twice. No elegant technique. No masterful swordsmanship. Just relentless, savage pressure from a creature that treated pain like fuel. "You're going to die if you keep this up." Judgment wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. The blood smeared across her cheek. "Then kill me faster." Jerimoth was quiet for a moment. Then he exhaled behind the helmet, a sound that could have been a laugh, and raised both swords. However, at that moment the atmosphere between the two of them changed. Not just the two of them, everyone started looking up, including Sail and the soldiers below. A colossal ship, that seemed made out of stones than metal, was arriving through the air. Chapter 1365 New Entrance, Part 1. Chapter 1365 New Entrance, Part 1. A tall, alabaster-skinned man with black hair and blue eyes stood on the roof of the tower. The ship itself carved through the air, its concrete bow dividing the wind of its own volition, carrying on at a sufficient speed. There had been a slight delay in arrival. He'd had to stop at Drywall and deal with the things threatening to swallow the place. But Revant had finally arrived at his master's order. He looked down with a fond smile on his face. Smiles rarely appeared on Revant's face, and when they did, they looked evil instead of accommodating. Scanning the cacophony below, Revant glanced at the two on the ship's deck. There were more people there, but only 2 of them caught his gaze. These were the 2 who had approached him a few weeks ago and demanded that he teach them. He had taken them as students and wanted to test what he had taught them, so his silent gaze spoke volumes. Linus and Jessi caught that gaze and turned forward, each stepping to the opposite edge of the ship, facing each side of the cacophony with unreadable expressions. Jessai's hair was longer now, reaching her shoulders and flying wild. Her dark circles persisted, and as she opened her hands, a red spear manifested into her grip. Her shadow turned to a pool threatening to swallow her whole, but instead, something spread across her body from her legs. She flew from the bow of the airship with one simple motion, the vile armor covering her entire body and face in the span of a breath, leaving only a dangerous red glint in the embrace of her visor, which looked like nothing but darkness. As Jessai landed on the ground, a terrifying shockwave spread outward and several soldiers were sent into the air like weightless dolls. She twirled her spear and charged forward, darkness trailing her. The first soldier didn't even see the spear. He saw the darkness, the shape barreling toward him, and the red glow where eyes should have been. Then the crimson tip punched through his chest and out the other side, and Jessai didn't stop. She ripped the spear free as she passed, spinning the shaft across her back and catching it underhanded in a motion so fluid it looked rehearsed by something inhuman. 3 soldiers rushed her from the left. The first swung his blade down in a committed arc, and Jessai stepped into it, not away. The shaft of her spear caught the sword at its base, redirected it into the ground, and the butt of the weapon cracked the soldier's jaw before his blade had finished its arc. She pivoted off that strike, whipping the spear around her waist like it weighed nothing, and the crimson tip opened the second soldier from hip to collar. The third hesitated. 1 step backward. Jessai didn't give him the second. Her spear drove through his shield, through the arm behind it, and pinned him to the man behind him that he'd stumbled into. 2 bodies on 1 thrust. She tore the weapon free and darkness bled from the wounds instead of blood, wisps of black curling off the steel like the spear itself was rotting everything it touched. There was something deeply wrong about the way she moved. It wasn't fast in the way that skilled warriors were fast. It was smooth in a way that made the body reject what it was seeing. Every motion flowed into the next without pause, without reset, without the natural hitch of a human body changing direction. The spear never stopped. It rolled across her shoulders, whipped around her forearm, stabbed and retracted and swept in an unbroken current of violence that turned the weapon into an extension of the darkness trailing behind her. A formation of 8 soldiers locked shields and braced. Jessai planted her foot and the ground cracked beneath it. She drove the spear into the center of the shield wall with both hands, and the formation didn't break, it caved. The impact folded the center 2 shields inward, crushing the men behind them into the soldiers at their flanks. Before the formation could recover, she swept the spear low, taking legs from 3 of them in one arc, and as they fell she was already past them, already killing the ones behind. The darkness that trailed her wasn't just a visual effect. Where it touched, soldiers' movements slowed, their reactions dulled, their footing failed them. Men stumbled over nothing. Swords swung a half-second too late. Eyes couldn't track her through the black mist that clung to her like a veil, and by the time they adjusted, the crimson point had already found them. From the rooftop of the ship, Revant watched. His fond smile hadn't faded. If anything, it had deepened, and that only made it look more sinister. Jessai carved a corridor through the Empire's ranks. Not a path. Corridor. Wide enough that the soldiers on either side recoiled from the edges of her darkness, pressing into their own lines to get away from whatever that thing was. The ones who had seen her land were already retreating. The ones who hadn't seen her yet could hear it. The screaming, the wet sounds of the spear doing its work, the unnatural silence where her darkness fell and swallowed sound itself. She stopped for a moment at the center of a clearing she'd made. Bodies around her, red spear dripping, visor glowing that terrible red through the dark, turning slowly, scanning. A mounted officer broke from the rear line and charged her with a lance. Heavy horse, heavy armor, committed. The kind of charge that ran through infantry like paper. Jessai didn't dodge. She waited instead. And at the last moment, she stepped to the side with the minimal distance required, let the lance pass her visor by inches, and drove her spear through the horse's neck as it passed. The momentum of the charge did the rest. Horse and rider collapsed forward, tumbling, and Jessai was already walking through the dust of their fall, stepping over the dying animal without looking down. That was what terrified them. She never looked down, never checked her kills, never glanced behind her. Every soldier she cut through was already forgotten the moment the spear left their body, and her visor was already fixed on the next one. There was no anger in the way she fought, no battle rage, no bloodlust. Just a cold, mechanical procession through their ranks that carried all the warmth of a plague moving through a village. The soldiers of the Empire had seen cruelty before. They had dealt it. But cruelty required emotion, required a person behind the violence who wanted to hurt. Whatever was behind that visor didn't seem to want anything at all. The soldiers nearest to her corridor broke ranks first. Then the ones behind them. Fear spread faster than the darkness did, and soon an entire flank of the Empire's formation was folding inward, men pressing away from the thing with the red spear and the black mist. Jessie didn't pursue the ones who ran. She kept walking forward, steady, relentless, cutting through anyone still standing in front of her with that same unbroken rhythm. From above, Revant finally turned his gaze to the other side of the ship where Linus had jumped. Not bad at all. He looked back at Jessie's trail of destruction. The fond, evil smile twitched. But she's the one who listened. Then he turned to Linus's direction. Chapter 1366 New Entrance, Part 2. Chapter 1366 New Entrance, Part 2. Revant seemed to be enjoying himself watching Jessie, but his sinister grin spread even wider when he turned his head over to Linus. Unlike Jessie, Linus was a more ferocious force on the battlefield, carrying a wrath that would probably make the soldiers think, "Hey, did I ever offend you or something?" When he dealt with a single soldier, he dealt with them more than necessary. His fighting style was crude and disastrous, all bludgeoning force and overkill. The once demure and elegant Linus who had been stolen from his home was long gone. All that remained of him now was a moving mass of anger and wrath. Linus was angry at everything. He was angry at the way the earth smelled, angry at the way the soldiers looked, angry at how they wielded their weapons and the way they shouted when they charged at him. He was angry at the dirt beneath his feet and the wind that blew against his face. The kind of anger that had nothing to do with the enemy in front of him and everything to do with a world that had taken too much. And when they came like that, he welcomed them with a hurricane of strikes. He twirled like the wind and blades flung in every direction, cutting down anything within arm's reach and beyond it. Seeing him this vicious on the battlefield made Revant reminisce about his younger days. After all, there had been a time when he too was disgusted by the whole world, when he was depressed and hated everyone and everything. He remembered standing over a field not unlike this one, cutting down men whose faces he never bothered to look at, not because he had a reason to kill them but because they were there and he needed something to break. Make no mistake, he still did. Now, though, he had found purpose and priorities. Revant stared down at him for a while and shook his head slightly. He will learn with time. Both of them had talent. Jessie's was insidiously devastating, and the dark enigma they had received as a heritage item only added to their ferocity. Linus possessed it too, but he had vehemently refused to rely on it, even right to Revant's face. Jessie at least knew she had no choice but to accept the power it offered. She needed everything she could get. Linus, though? That guy was arrogant. And seeing how he was performing despite that arrogance, Revant could almost understand it. His talent worked like a liquid that solidified on contact, something with properties resembling mercury, though the young man himself insisted it wasn't. According to Linus, the material was poisonous to the body. He had refrained from using it excessively because he valued nonsensical codes like honor and integrity. Apparently, killing an enemy with poison was beneath him. All Revant could do hearing him talk like that was shake his head. Those codes were the main reason for Linus's own stagnation. Revant had long since deemed such things useless. Integrity and honor only mattered in a world that had been carved out of integrity and honor in the first place. The world they existed in now ran on the backs of those who had betrayed their own mothers and used them to gain a higher level of power. It was a facade, and that facade had bled into its inhabitants. Linus trying to be different was commendable, but it was going to become a problem. They were eventually going to fight people who treated concepts like honor as nothing more than exploitable weaknesses. At his current level of restriction, Linus was already fearsome enough. But enough for now was not enough for what was coming. Revant shook his head at the young arrogant man once again. This was why he preferred Jessie. Even though Linus was stronger by a considerable margin, Jessie had far more ferocious potential. She wasn't even a sage and she was already fighting at speeds comparable to theirs. More importantly, when power was offered to her, she took it. No hesitation, no philosophy, no deliberation about whether the source was clean enough for her conscience. She simply consumed what was given and turned it into carnage. That was the kind of instinct that survived. Linus carved his way through the battlefield, silvery wings of metal splayed behind his back, his sword slicing across the ranks of soldiers as he whizzed through them. Blood trailed through the air in his wake. His strikes were too fast to follow most of the time, and when he surged forward, there was no shield strong enough to stop his advance. He crushed the shield in front of him with his foot alone. The soldier must have felt every bone in his arms shatter from that single impact. The shield itself, as if not registering the damage fast enough, held its shape for a moment. The soldier's eyes went wide above the rim, his mouth open around a scream that hadn't arrived yet. Then the shield broke apart into large pieces all at once, and the scream finally caught up with the pain. Metal shattering beneath the force of a kick. Revant found that genuinely interesting. The soldier tore away from his position and went cartwheeling across the ground, crashing into several of his comrades. Linus's sword flew through the air in a cruel arc and tore through the metal armor of the nearest Guardian soldier with ease. It caught him across the shoulder, leaving his torso severely mangled, blood spraying from the wound like a gruesome shower. Linus spared the devastation no second glance and flew forward, a blur of speed and metal. Those he passed without swinging at were not pardoned either. His wings were sharp metal in form, and he could extend or retract their length at will. His passage left a wake of blood and falling bodies in both directions. When he landed in the center of a formation where the strongest soldiers had concentrated, men who immediately locked their shields together into a wall of overlapping steel, Linus didn't even slow down. The wall held for exactly one rotation. His sword hit first, cracking the formation open from one side, and his wings followed through from the other, scattering shields and the men holding them like debris in a storm. The force he wielded was strange and unbefitting of his lean frame. It made the soldiers confused, bordering on terrified, especially when they were being cut down before they even saw what was coming. The two forces that had been added to the battlefield in such a short time were making a visible difference against the vast mass of the Guardian army, an army that had initially seemed like it would never thin no matter how many arrows struck them. Moreover, it wasn't like the rain of arrows had stopped because of the entrance. In fact, another massive downpour of white lights was already falling on the soldiers again. Chapter 1367 Sells Words. Chapter 1367 Sells Words. Sale was as surprised as he was amused to see the new entrance. He had been worried about the ship for a brief moment before he recognized it as familiar. It hadn't been long since Northern pulled up in Drywall with a ship like this one. But that was not what truly aided his remembrance. That recognition only came later. What truly helped him remember was the terrifying Storm Bastion. Although this vessel seemed far more inferior to that striking and threatening warship, their resemblance was somewhat undeniable, as if they had all come from the same manufacturer. And when Jesai and Linus spun off the ship and joined the fray below, reducing great swathes of soldiers to nothing but empty corpses, the presence of the two made so much difference that Sale had to pause for a moment to watch them each. The one in dark and ominous armor moved like he was a sage. There was no wasted motion in his combat, every step folding into the next strike as though the violence was choreographed before it happened. Soldiers closed around him and it made no difference. He moved through them the way a blade moves through cloth, and the bodies he left behind barely seemed to understand they were dead. The one with wings moved like he was an ascendant. Where the armored one was precise, this one was overwhelming. He descended on clusters of soldiers and scattered them like debris, his wings carving through ranks with a speed that Sale's trained eyes could barely track. Sale had spent years reading the trajectories of fast-moving things, and even he struggled to follow the path of those wings. Both of them fought like forces instead of people, and it was somewhat inspiring to see. Sale was not a close-range combatant, and he had long made peace with the role he was to play in battle. But watching these two at a moment like this made him feel somewhat wistful. They made close combat look like an art, and he would be lying if he said some part of him didn't wish he could do the same. Of course, he was fast. Fast enough, even. It was simply what it was. Sale did not have the ability utilization to sustain close-range combat for long. For a short burst, sure, he would do handsomely well, but a drawn-out battle like this one would inevitably play to his disadvantage. I can just support them instead, and this will end quickly. Sale shook his head and threw the thoughts out of his mind, then focused on the cacophony below him. He drew Ty Turner's string, using it to summon hundreds of arrows in the air. Since his essence was getting siphoned, he had to be quite careful of how he spent each volley, but against masses like this, using Luna Aria was still the most effective approach. Sale narrowed his gaze with determination and released the string. Immediately hundreds of arrows descended upon the vast flood of men that filled the plain and devastated all of them. As soldiers raised their shields, the arrows of light exploded through with brutal force. Some changed direction mid-flight to strike into exposed eyes, throwing soldiers backward and slamming them into the men behind them. Others bit into shoulders and tore all the way down to the torso. Some were powerful enough to sever limbs entirely. The soldiers released cries of horror and scattered helter-skelter for their lives. The arrows had reduced in number but grown in potency, gaining more power and sharpness, and as if that was not enough, every path the soldiers turned it was as though death was already waiting for them. To them this was a strange battle, the type they had never fought before. Usually, numbers like theirs should be crashing into a comparable force and fighting on equal footing, slashing at their enemy, using their talents to destroy them and showing the true might and coordination of the Empire. They had never been in a situation where all of them would be confronted by just one man, or sometimes just three. The Empire had always been on the other side of this equation. They had always been the ones to send out a single terrifying combatant to display the might of the Empire against lesser forces. There was no precedent for the Empire themselves tasting the dirt and insult they were so accustomed to dishing out. No formation worked. Their drills and daily training were useless because they were siege forces, trained to tear down fortresses, to confront greater numbers of monsters or humans and diminish them within their formations. But nothing in their training had ever addressed how to deal with one man of terrifying strength, much less three. To make matters worse, their commander was missing for some reason, and his assistant, the man they respected and depended on, who had led them well over the years, was away dealing with the enemy on his own end. Then more joined the fray. A terrifying creature that seemed torn out of an evil darkness descended upon them, moving with unfair speed and wielding a spear like it was some sharp rope. Their power was pure destruction, and the moment they stepped into battle, the soldiers began to slowly discover that their talents were not working. The one who could harden terrain activated his talent and felt the familiar pull of essence leave his body. But the ground beneath him stayed soft. He tried again. Nothing. The earth that should have turned to stone remained loose dirt, and the soldiers who had been relying on the hardened ground for footing stumbled as an arrow of light punched through the man beside them. The healer who journeyed among the ranks restoring soldiers pressed his hands to a dying man's chest and felt his talent reach out, then collapse like a flame smothered under wet cloth. The wound stayed open. Blood kept pouring. He moved to the next soldier and tried again with the same result, and then the next, and a cold understanding settled into him that something on that battlefield was eating his power before it could take hold. The men who flanked and protected him met brutal ends at the hands of the arrows of light, picked off one by one as though the archer above could see them perfectly through the chaos, until the healer himself was torn apart by the sharp wing of another who was deceiving himself thinking he was a monster. Things got worse. The numbers increased. A woman with vermilion hair flew off the ship with flames propelling her into the sky before she landed with a tremendous explosion that rolled across the land, consuming the ranks of several soldiers. The flames were merciless and undulating, and more cries tore through the starry skies of midnight. A girl in dark metal armor flew out of the ship too, a pair of mismatched wings unfolding behind her, each one spanning over 30 meters. One was obsidian while the other was white. She twirled into the air and took a downward dive as several orbs of light formed around her. When she touched the ground, an explosion of pure white radiance covered the world. Chapter 1368 First Humiliation. Chapter 1368 First Humiliation. One more drifter flew off the airship and joined the fray below, each one wielding an unfair amount of strength. The soldiers had lost their talents, and without them, they were little more than targets. From that point onward, morale plunged to the bottom of their hearts. Men were suffering great losses and watching their friends and partners fall. This was the 7th Legion of the Empire. They prided themselves on siege battles. There was no fortress they wouldn't have been able to take down. Ryugen was the least of them. If the Empire had ever worried about a nation, it would never have been Ryugen. They were simply too small, too insignificant. No one had imagined the small nation would spend its resources on sellswords, mercenaries with such deleterious power. The soldiers suffered devastating casualties, men falling and dying to their left and to their right. Their enemies were brutal, impregnable. The soldiers were debuffed and greatly weakened, and fear crept deeper into their hearts with every killing blow they were dealt. Fire rolled across the ranks, and some had to watch the mates they'd shared meals with, the friends they'd fought to protect, cry and suffer in agony while they could do nothing but turn and run for their own lives. Raising a shield was useless because nothing was stopping the drifters' advance anymore. These people were simply too strong. Their strength made no sense, and it was baffling that any caliber of fighter like this had been developing somewhere without the Empire's notice. A tanned woman with thick muscles tore across their ranks with blows that crushed them outright. One of her punches sank into the face of a soldier, and despite the closed helmet, his entire face caved inward along with the metal. Teeth, eyes, all of it splattered out from the force. She practically ripped him off his feet and punched him into the ground, burying him there. She shot forward with a speed that sent shockwaves rippling through her surroundings, twirled, and smashed the back of her fist into the temple of another soldier. His armor split. Blood sprayed from him, and his comrades could only watch with wide eyes as both helmet and head scattered in fragments, painting everyone nearby in red. And the woman's onslaught did not stop there. She barreled forward and grabbed another soldier, tore him off the ground, and slammed him back into the earth. Then she raised her lower body, swinging her legs through the air with her hands planted on the ground, and the legs smashed into anyone who dared to come closer, simply crushing them, no questions asked. Her kicks were breaking swords and cracking the prideful shields of the Guardian soldiers like they were made of clay. Swords fell to the ground. Shields were no longer raised with vigor. The great army of the Empire was being routed at the hands of people they would call riffraff. This small nation, Ryugen, was handing them shame and humiliation on a platter of plastic, and in all the books of history, across every age of powerful drifters that had come and passed, no nation had ever dealt the Empire this manner of defeat. The soldiers themselves began to scream for retreat in their desperation to escape the savagery, since their standing commander was nowhere to be found. Retreat! Retreat! The cry sounded somewhere between the ranks and traveled quickly. The soldiers fell into formation, though the word was generous for what it actually was. Men stumbled over the fallen, abandoned shields clattering against the bodies of those who would never retrieve them. They pushed back into the plains with none of the discipline they had marched in with, tearing away from their enemies in a tide of clanking steel and ragged breath. Sail turned and made to chase them across the air. The other two had the same thought. Raven had already unveiled her wings, and Annette had dashed into the sky when a cold presence washed over all of them. It hit like plunging into deep water. The heat of the battle, the momentum of their pursuit, the blood still singing from victory, all of it went quiet in an instant. Something vast and heavy had settled over the battlefield, pressing against their skin, and every instinct they possessed told them the same thing at once. They all stopped and turned. The source of the presence stood in the center of the battlefield where the soldiers had just vacated. A single soldier who seemed to have been left behind, or, in more sensible terms, had refused to leave. They all turned fully toward the presence, all at the same time. His crimson cape flew back and fluttered in the wind that was suddenly picking up, as if the air itself wanted to be dramatic. The land fell silent. Only the distant clash of metal between Jerimoth and Judgment still sounded, that one battle continuing regardless of everything else. Jerimoth was distracted at some point when he noticed the lone presence, and he smiled, but Judgment had not missed the chance to smash his face and send him reeling back. The man standing there reached for the clasps of his armor and unfastened them one at a time. No urgency or acknowledgement that 6 powerful drifters were watching him from every direction. He pulled the breastplate free and let it drop beside him, then rolled his shoulders as though the armor had been the only thing bothering him about this entire battle. Red hair, slick with sweat, fell across his face. He shook his head and pearls of moisture scattered into the air. He carried himself as if he were simply stepping out of a bath in a warm spring. Then he swept his hair back with one hand, glanced at the helmet still in his grip, and tossed it away. The metal clanked against the ground with a hollow sound. Feeling pretty useless now. No one moved. The wind carried the faint smell of iron and smoke across the field, and in the silence, the 6 drifters watched the lone man who stood among the dead as comfortably as if he owned the ground beneath them. The man fixed Sail with his crimson eyes first. On the left corner of his eye, there was a scar that curved around the edge, old and deliberate. Smiling with no ounce of hostility, he spoke to Sail, but his voice carried loud enough that everyone on the field could hear. "Hello! You there on the Black Mount, you're the Arrow Sage, right? Good stars. I've heard so many awesome things about you. You are even more amazing in person. I enjoyed every last bit of this show." His smile got creepier. "I am Zebulon, the commander of the Nightbloods. Shall we get started? Properly this time." Chapter 1369 Commander Zebulon. Chapter 1369 Commander Zebulon. The air was cold, and the man who stood at the center of everything emanated an aura that made Sail's hairs stand on end. "He's heard about me? I haven't heard of him. Who could he be?" Sail searched his mind but found no answer. Still, he continued to stare at the man. Cautiously, after making his last statement, Zebulon casually walked forward and picked up a dead body as he went. "I'm curious, though." He dragged the corpse by the leg. "Just how much did Ryugen spend to hire people like you? Especially you, Arrow Sage? Do they really think that pouring resources that should be reserved for the Empire into the purchase of handymen will save them from total annihilation? Or, if the Emperor is benevolent, slavery?" With the punctuation of his last word, he hurled the corpse straight into the air. The lifeless body rolled and wheeled towards Sail, who pulled out an ordinary arrow, knocked it to the bow and fired. The shaft caught the body mid-flight and carried it away with enough force to send it tumbling across the field. Sail turned to the man in holy anger and descended. Have you no honor for the fallen? These are men who fought for your nation. The reason they're dead is because your nation demanded it. These people should be the pride and backbone of your military strength. How dare you use them as mere projectiles?" The man looked at him with an unreadable expression. And then, "No." Sail frowned, confused. "You're wrong." Zebulon's voice carried the patience of someone correcting a child. "The only reason they died is to be useful to me, you dimwit. I'm their commander. I own them. Value of the Empire? Honor? These dimwits." He lowered a disgusted gaze at the bodies scattered around him. Then he returned his attention to Sail. "Honor and value are things retained only for the strong. Shouldn't you know best, that it is wrong to coddle the weak?" He went silent for a moment, then his voice came again. "Then again, I did hear you can be too virtuous sometimes. Preachy too." He pointed his index finger at Sail. "Careful there." In that instant, a soldier burst forward with immense speed, crossing the distance between them in less than 2 seconds, an arrow gripped in his fist like a dagger. But 2 seconds had been enough time for Raven to move. Her wings fluttered, her sword flashed, and the soldier's head went spinning into the sky. The headless body went still. Sail drew his bow ready. Then the body moved. Sail was quick this time. He released the tide-turner strings, and the arrow punched into the body's chest, driving it back several meters. The body stopped for a moment, then continued forward the next. Sail drew more arrows. The first drove it back. Then another and another and another again, but the corpse simply absorbed each hit and kept walking like it was nothing. It pulled one of Sail's arrows from its own chest and gripped it in its free hand while continuing forward. Sail's stomach dropped. What in the world is this? Raven intercepted and cut the body cleanly in half at the waist. Both halves fell apart for a moment. The next, both rose on their own, acting as two separate beings. "Leave it to me!" Annette shouted and exploded forward, wreathed in flame. She crashed down on both halves, and from her legs a floor of fire erupted outward, radiating heat so intense that Sail had to leap back while Raven frowned. "Instructor Annette, please be demure." "Demure? Really? How about this for demure?" The flames surged and rolled outward in ferocious waves that swept past Raven. Sail leaped clear while the nightmare wyvern met him in the air, and they reunited. Raven, who Sail had seen consumed by the inferno, was floating above the flames on her mismatched wings. Meanwhile, Annette's fire raced forward like it had been infected with madness, roaring towards Zebulon. Zebulon stared at the approaching tide of flames with a small, playful smile. Then the corpses between him and the fire began to rise. All of them were burning, skin blackening and peeling, but they didn't stop. They dashed forward through the inferno. It was like watching figures charge through a furnace, and not a single one of them cared for the flames eating away at their flesh. One finally lunged out of the fire and grabbed Annette by the face. She froze with shock, her vermilion eyes staring down at the charred hand clamped over her mouth. "What in the—" The corpse swung its arm overhead, but Annette simply looked at it with irritation and twisted free of its grip. The motion was so powerful that the corpse's hand wrenched loose like wet cloth, and the whole body went spinning into the air before it could complete the punch. More corpses were reaching her now, but she simply punched and kicked them away. They flew off in an almost cartoonish manner while Zebulon watched, the playful smile still on his face, looking quite relaxed. Annette drove her fist into another one's gut. Fire erupted from her knuckles and scorched through the corpse, but even burning, it continued to march forward until she sent it sailing with a second blow. Annette dealt with the last of the approaching corpses and shouted, "Is this it? All that aura and you're just gonna throw thralls at us?" Zebulon's smile slowly left his lips. "Goodness. Underestimating me is very bad for the safety of your life." He grabbed 2 more soldiers and sent them flying. Sail drew his bow and locked his aim on the 2, then released a pair of arrows. As the arrows flew, the corpses twisted on their own mid-air, fluidly dodging the shafts before catching them in their hands. Both descended on Annette, armed with Sail's own arrows. "Hello everyone, this is Shadow. Due to copyright restrictions on YouTube, I can't publish many of the audiobooks you love. That's why I've created a special paid service where you can enjoy over 300 high-quality audiobooks from platforms like Webnovel, Pocket FM, Audible, Wuxia, and more. Each novel comes as a one-time purchase, no subscriptions, no hidden fees. After payment, you'll receive full access via Telegram, along with all future updates for that novel. You'll find a wide selection of your favorite genres and titles, always in premium audio quality. Check the full list of available novels in the description. DM me now to get your favorite stories in audiobook form and start listening today.